Good morning. This is WBOR 91.1 FM Brunswick. Thank you for listening. This is Bear Tracks. My name is Roger Wilder.
And I'm John Erlinson.
And this is our show where once a week, 10 to 11 a.m. on Thursdays.
9 to 10.
11, 9 to 10. It's a little too early. We talk about a different environmental topic, either an animal or an ecosystem or some big environmental issue, to hopefully share with you something you didn't know about the natural world and expand your perspective and appreciation for it as you explore. This week we'll be talking about invasive and endemic species. Before that, we'll talk a little about the impetus behind the theme for this show, which kind of started through our spring break trips, different places in the tropics. John, would you like to start us off? Tell us about your trip to Puerto Rico a little bit, not to spoil it all.
Yeah, sure. So over our 2-week spring break, I spent the first week with my girlfriend, and we went down to Puerto Rico, which is obviously a U.S. territory, I believe. And but it's an island, and so islands are really special in terms of ecology and evolutionarily because they're so isolated from the rest of land. So when you think of terrestrial organisms, be it plants, bugs, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, whatever you want to think of, a lot of those, unless they can fly or swim great distances, depending on the distance of the island, they're completely separate from other animals like themselves, which causes speciation events. You think of the classic, like Darwin coming to the New World and finding all the birds on the different islands in the Caribbean. Maybe one of them was Puerto Rico, but I don't think so.
I'm not sure how.
And so when you're separate from everything else for so long, you evolve to your specific habitat and the environment around you, the climate and the other organisms, and eventually that results in completely unique species, which are known as endemic species, which we'll get into. I don't know if I should get completely into all like the specifics of Puerto Rico, the endemics, and then some of the invasive species. But maybe you want to just touch about where you went. I don't know.
Yeah. For sure. I think it's definitely sets a good theme for the show. Absolutely. My name is Roger. Again, I went to Cancun and Riviera Maya in Yucatan in Mexico, and spent a week in Costa Rica as well, exploring down there. And both these areas, being very tropical, are also just great places to see a lot of amazing wildlife, a lot of great nature. They don't have the unique diversity of life quite like Puerto Rico, just because they're not islands, and islands do, again, we'll talk more about this later, really have a very standalone evolutionary history with very little influx or outflux of organisms, so they evolve very separately on islands. But even in the Yucatan especially, and all through Central America, because really the whole area is kind of an isthmus connecting the large masses of North and South America, you get a ton of really unique species of wildlife. In Mexico, spent some time exploring some Mayan ruins, which was my other great interest. Coba down in southern Yucatan, and Chichen Itza as well. It's a bit more industrial, a bit more built up, but a lot of great species there. So an ocellated turkey, which is this Yucatan endemic bird, kind of like our turkeys, but much more beautiful. Bright blue head, orange speckles, brown and white with iridescent sheen all around. Really neat species. Tons of great insects and amphibians as well. I appreciated them. Some of my other roommates, I think, less so. By the time a bat flew into our Costa Rica Airbnb living room, I think people were pretty ready to go. But in Costa Rica as well, because it's such a thin strip of land between both the Pacific and the Atlantic, you get a ton of really interesting species. You get lots of bat species. I mentioned the one that flew into our common room. I saw a bocaraca in Spanish, or an eyelash pit viper, which is pretty neat from a distance. And a variety of really great birds. Tons of hummingbird species, a resplendent quetzal, which is this beautiful green bird. Again, the downside of radio is we can't show off pictures for these animals, but definitely worth looking up. But tropics also have this strange dynamic between invasive and endemic species. And if you don't know what those words are, that's okay. We're going to explain them. But being in these two pretty unique places for the last 2 weeks, I think really set a good precedent to talk about this and made us think more critically about a lot of the animals and interactions within this place.
Yeah. And before we dive right into, I suppose we should probably, before we get into the examples of our trips, we should define each of the things, maybe that makes more
I think that'd
sense.
probably be a good idea just to guide the viewers or
But
listeners.
just in terms of if you have travel plans coming up to a place you've never been before, or maybe a place you've been 100 times, but you've never really thought about the natural world too much, look up iNaturalist online, and
that's great.
you can filter to a specific location, and then you can even look at specific types of animals. But you can just look up and you can see the observations that people have logged at that place, and it's just a great way to see all, or maybe just a small chunk, to see the variety of things that you can see there. Be it like, a huge iguana that you probably have seen, or, maybe small birds that you've never considered before. I think it's just a great way to like get an idea of what's there, and then you can keep an eye out for it when it's there. And I mean, I'll guarantee it will add a little bit to your trip, a little bit of joy and experience to your trip.
For sure. It gives you much better insight, I think, into what's there.
Right. So, I kind of briefly defined endemic, and the definitions of these won't take too long. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but if something is endemic, say, to Puerto Rico, that means it only exists on Puerto Rico. So there are like 18 bird species. I'll get into some of the other species endemic to Puerto Rico. They might also be in a few surrounding islands or something like that, but they're pretty much considered endemic. And often these species are particularly vulnerable to extinction or critically endangered because they inhabit such a small territory. But endemic species can be anywhere, right? A species can be endemic to the Americas, like the mountain lion, cougar, puma, whatever you want. It has a million different names because it's got such a large range from Canada down to Argentina. But it is still endemic to this huge area rather than in Eurasia or Australia. Obviously, Australia and New Zealand are great examples as well, being islands, the large, of having a variety of endemic species. Or a species can be endemic to a habitat, like the arboreal forests up north, or a polar bear is endemic to the Arctic, though it's on a bunch of different land masses, it's still endemic to that general region. I think that's true.
It totally makes sense. I mean, it can be on any scale, huge endemic across a continent. You have something like a Florida scrub jay endemic to just Florida. You can only see it there. So it's the definition, I think, is mostly applied to the areas that are smaller just because they're of more, I think, biological interest, but definitely can extend to large scales.
Right.
Invasive species are the other animals we'll be talking about today. This is even more self-explanatory. An animal that basically has come from somewhere else and has settled in a new place, either on its own or with the assistance of humans, for better or worse. Invasive species, the name invasive has this connotation of being something negative, and most invasive species do have pretty negative impacts on native species, especially those on islands. We'll get more into that later, but those of smaller communities. But a lot of species that come from elsewhere can have minimal impact or can even have a positive impact, and those species are often considered non-native. And so you have this kind of dichotomy between invasive species and non-native organisms that fall under the same sort of umbrella as invaders, or at least traveling organisms. And I think there's this big juxtaposition between invasive and endemic species in a lot of habitats. And so it's important to, I think, discuss one with the other and to really paint a holistic picture of what's going on in the natural world.
I do want to touch quick on, and before we get into this stuff, do you want to do I guess I'll just talk about Puerto Rico.
That'd be great. But, I think staying with the trip focus is good.
One thing I think that's interesting, I was reminded of this morning just listening to a YouTube video, is that invasive species, just one general characteristic of them, and this is often in direct contrast to endemic species, is that they're typically generalist species. Meaning, as sort of self-explanatory in the name, that they're comfortable surviving and they thrive in a variety of environments, or under a variety of environmental conditions. Or if you think of a predator, they prey on a bunch of different things. I just would say a lot of common, I guess, predators you think of are pretty generalist, like bears, that are carnivorous and omnivorous, eating berries and fish,
mongoose,
things like that, like
later.
The mongoose, which I'll get into. And then endemic species, often because they're specifically involved just to the island they're on, are specialized. They're hyper evolved to that exact climate, to that exact environment. And then when you when humans typically, almost always, bring a new species to this, say, island where, like a mongoose, which I'll get into, where there are literally no mammals besides bats, so there are no large mammals. About as big as you get is like maybe a large lizard terrestrially, or maybe a bird. That can completely alter. It completely misaligns with how these species that have specifically evolved to these environments work. You know, it's sort of like the idea of a deer in headlights, where deers haven't evolved to, 2,000-pound metal objects coming at them at 60 miles an hour with the lights flashing on like the sun. So I guess we're getting a call.
We're getting a phone call. I'm not sure how to patch this through, but I can take it. Hello, this is John and Roger on Bear Tracks, WBOR.
Hey, I'm really enjoying the show. Great show. Sorry if you're not. Is it okay to call in?
Oh no, it's totally fine to call in. Thank you for asking. I'm sorry we're not able to patch you through, but we'd love to hear.
I'm hearing her in my headphones, so I think she's coming through on the radio.
Oh, hopefully.
Yeah, no, they sound like great trips. I'm jealous. I'm here in Maine.
Oh yeah. We were kind of hoping to escape the cold weather.
Yeah, it's you're really lucky. You get to go this place.
Oh yeah, very fortunate. It definitely helps us kind of think more about our biology majors outside of the main context as well.
Does she have a specific question or anything?
Is there anything we could any questions you have we could address, or any interest specifically we could talk about?
Yeah, I think just like having awareness of how privileged we are to get to go on these trips, is something I definitely struggle with, and just figuring out raising kids, like, how much to expose them to these experiences, and I'm such income inequality, and, just the awareness that so many people don't have access to these opportunities.
Well, thank you.
Right.
As a parent, yeah.
It is. I think that is very important, and we're both very fortunate to have these opportunities. And I think we're trying to kind of use what we learn while traveling like this to kind of apply it to Maine and really offer insight into local communities as well to kind of expand just a general appreciation for wildlife in this show.
Right, and I think it also is like your question. Thank you for calling in. Maybe it was hard to hear for those in the radio. She was talking about like understanding and like grappling with like sort of the privilege to go to these amazing places, and the idea that not everybody might have that privilege. And I think that that's why science communication, like we're trying to do here, is important, and making local, because the local ecology and environments are also fantastic. So making local programs and making the local environments more accessible, and teaching people better ways that they can interact with their local environments is important as well. And also brings into the idea of like ecotourism, where, some place like Hawaii kind of struggles with this, where there's so many tourists coming in to look at the ecology, and it's not an inherently bad thing, but understanding like when you're visiting a place, like whether it's a national park or an island like Hawaii, you must respect the animals and the plants there, and just generally be conscious of how you're traveling, and understand that it's not necessarily your space. It's a space of the endemic animals and plants and the people that live there. Thank you for calling. I think we might kind of.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I really enjoyed the show, and I think just bringing that into the conversation. We also struggle with the carbon footprint of travel right now. Like, how many flights per year is a socially responsible thing to do? If you're trying to be mindful of your carbon footprint. I'm not saying I've figured it out.
Oh no, it's very true. I think especially talking
Can you repeat
about.
the question?
I'm sorry. Yes, the question for all the listeners was, or the statement was just to kind of be mindful of the carbon footprint, especially when doing these big trips and traveling, and the impact that even travel with an environmental focus can have on climate change and environment as a whole. And I think that is a very important thing to consider, especially monitoring your own impact on the environment when you're hoping to explore, even with a lens of looking at wildlife, and definitely keeping that at the forefront, or at least in mind while discussing topics like this is definitely crucial. And I really appreciate you for calling in and bringing that to light, and as helping us stay focused on that as we talk through our show.
Yeah, it's just something I'm grappling with myself. Thanks so much for hearing us out. Great. Keep it up.
No, thank you, and I think that's,
Thanks for tuning in.
We hope to kind of help people think in those terms as well as we speak. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
All right. Sort of to get back on track, we appreciate that. If you ever want to call in, but we'll try to figure out a better way to patch that through, because it sounds like you all out there couldn't quite hear what she was saying in the future. But you can also text us if you have a question that maybe is easier to. We have a screen here we can watch. But yeah, thanks to everybody for tuning in. Reminder, you're listening at 91.1 FM, WBOR here at Bowdoin College. Our names are John and Roger, and this is our show Bear Treks.
And we hope to share interests with you, but we're always very appreciative to hear your thoughts as well. And
Right.
And then we'd love to tailor this to people's interests as well. So thank you for your input.
Yeah, and yeah, I feel like we kind of we were at the point where we sort of finished defining invasive species, and just generally like thinking about how invasive typically are good at surviving in a variety of areas. That's why they can adapt to these foreign environments, but then the environments there aren't adapted to them, and the specialized species to those environments are typically outcompeted when those invasive non-native species are brought in, which one way those are often brought in is things like tourism or etc. Yeah, so I guess I'll try to kind of quickly talk about some of my experiences in Puerto Rico, and maybe Roger, you can ask some questions if anything arise, or talk about some other experiences you've had. But yeah, some of the examples of endemic and invasive species that my girlfriend and I saw. So obviously I'm a birder. I got into researching the species in Puerto Rico, looking for the endemic birds on the island. There's around 18 endemic species. It kind of varies depending on where you look. But these include the Puerto Rican toady, which is an adorable, and sort of many of the islands in the Caribbean have their own species of toady, but they're all separate species because they've been evolving separately for many, many years on these different islands. But they're adorable little green birds with like a pale breast, and on the top they have like a little red patch. If you're at home, I really recommend looking up toady birds, TODY, Puerto Rican toadies. There's a Puerto Rican owl, which Hannah and I heard at night at our Airbnb that was in the jungle, which was lovely. I'll talk about that a little bit more later when I get into the endemic frogs. Puerto Rican woodpecker, which is just crazy. It looks a lot different. It still looks like a woodpecker, but it looks a lot different than the woodpeckers that look here. Just kind of the coloration is kind of weird. A Puerto Rican lizard cuckoo, and 5 different hummingbird species that you can't find anywhere else, which are really a pain to try and identify. But when we were on a smaller island off of Puerto Rico called Culebra, I was able to pick out 2 of them because there were only 2 on that island as opposed to 5 on the main Puerto Rican island. So that was helpful. In terms of frogs, Puerto Rico is known for, and they really love their coqui frogs, which make this noise that sounds like the name, sort of like I forget what that is called, but it's like the chickadee name also sounds like chickadees go chickadee-dee-dee. I've made that noise on the show before already. But coqui frogs kind of go like coqui, and there's like a dozen or more, I think, species of coqui frogs that are all only found on Puerto Rico. And at our Airbnb that we stayed at, that was pretty much in the jungle. It was lovely. It was sort of like glamping situation, and like the walls were just nets and stuff. And like the shower was pretty much outside, like very exposed to the elements. Like we went to sleep to the sound of just thousands of these coqui frogs all around us, which was really lovely. And they also kept sneaking into the Airbnb in the shower, which was pretty much outside. Like at night, we went to shower. There were like 4 frogs sitting in the shower,
keeping you company.
And, yeah, there were a couple in the bed when we came back one day that I had to sort of get out. Important thing, it's also the start of amphibian migration season. is happening when they start breeding and everything. So keep a lookout for vernal pools in the forest, which are just like standing water in a forest that's not always there. And since there's no fish there to prey on eggs and stuff, that's where a lot of amphibians, salamanders, newts, frogs go to breed and lay eggs. And often they'll be crossing a road, so keep a lookout for little guys crossing the road, because that is just, it is, you go out to look for amphibians, which is awesome. Like if it's raining, be really careful.
Yeah, and that's here in Maine, so we can maybe highlight more about, Big Night and then the kind of great amphibian migration later on.
Right. But you have to be, maybe we could do like a whole episode on amphibians.
That would be a good idea.
But just be weary of, if you're going to handle a frog, maybe all amphibians, make sure to get your hands wet, because they do breathe through their skin, and the oils on your skin can be pretty damaging to them. And when you're driving on a rainy day, come spring, keep a lookout for little guys hopping or crawling across the street, because they really are just doomed by cars, and it kills a whole lot of them. Back to Puerto Rico. They have so many anoles, which are just kind of small lizards. So many species that are only found in Puerto Rico. Everywhere you look, pretty much anywhere in Puerto Rico, if you stop and you look around, even in the middle of San Juan, their largest city, you'll see an anole or something crawling on the wall. And I unfortunately, researching this episode last night, I just found out that there is a species of reptile called the culebra skink. The culebra is the little island we went off. Skinks are sort of like anoles, but a little bit larger generally. This is this Culebra Island, I think, is like 5 miles by 2 miles or something. Very small. You can drive from one end to the other at about 30 miles an hour in maybe 10 minutes, 20 minutes. You can't go quite that fast because some of the roads have potholes, or they're just like speed bumps, or lizards in the middle of the road, or roosters. There are chickens all over Puerto Rico. Also an introduced species, but from what I could tell, they're apparently not too harmful. I guess they're just kind of everywhere. But this is, I think, a great example of how specialized and localized some of these endemic species are. In that tiny island is the only place you can find this species of skink, the species of reptile, and thus naturally it is critically endangered, because any small tip of the scale, could completely wipe out the species, whatever humans might do or whatnot, even like a natural disaster. In Puerto Rico, as I said earlier, the only native species are bats. So there are several native species of bats, I think maybe 5 or something, and these are the only native terrestrial mammals. Obviously, there's marine mammals that are that are around Puerto Rico. But when you look up the species on Puerto Rico and you go to mammals, the first 10 that come up, most observed, are all introduced species. Domestic cats, domestic dogs, things like this that I'll get into. And then the last endemic species I wanted to highlight, obviously there are so many species of insect. One highlight of that Airbnb, which is to the theme of critters that Roger's talking about with their experience in Costa Rica, was there was a pool at this Airbnb, and 2 mornings we woke up, and at the bottom of the pool, unfortunately dead, I think because of the chlorine, were these foot-long centipedes.
Wow.
The largest species of centipede in Puerto Rico, and also endemic, native to Puerto Rico. Which is if you think about what a foot looks like and you think about a centipede, that's pretty intimidating. So I scooped him out of the bottom of the pool to try to save him, but I guess kind of glad they were pretty much immobilized.
Yeah, that's frightening for sure.
Yeah. Should I get into some of the Puerto Rico invasive species, and then maybe we take a break for the ads? What do you think?
Sure. I think it'd also be good to kind of move into some more kind of broader sense of what the invasive endemics would be. But you want to give some overview highlights, and we can maybe take a little pause?
Yeah, sure. So just some of the invasive species in Puerto Rico, and often these are cool. These are still exciting animals to see. It's just unfortunate the impacts they have. Green iguanas, which are native to Costa Rica. Originally they were brought as pets. We're going to talk into general ways that invasive species move around later, but the pet trade is a big one. Also, cats and dogs all over the island. Many people know, obviously, house cats can be pretty problematic for songbirds, and dogs, I don't know as much about what they do for the environment, but all these stray dogs and dogs that people just allow to roam free, because many of them are stray dogs that they've just sort of adopted, I imagine they can't be great for certain species.
Probably not. I think the cats and dogs often do help catch rats, though, and I don't know about in Puerto Rico specifically, but a lot of islands where rats have become an invasive species and a big issue in their own right. I think they can kind of serve a benefit, but overall likely more of a threat than anything.
Right. Yeah, so just a little bit more on the green iguana. They have no natural predators, like I talked about earlier. This is a hallmark of an invasive species. They have like over 50 natural predators in their native range, but on Puerto Rico, there are no natural predators because none of the species are evolved to a large iguana species. So that's like a niche that was not previously occupied, so nobody else cared to bother with it. Yeah, so how they're dealing with this in Puerto Rico is they're killing eggs during the egg season. These iguanas can lay up to like 75 eggs per female or something. So they are kind of going around and, it's kind of sad. They're crushing the eggs, but it's for the betterment of the vegetation, the rest of the species that live on the island that are being outcompeted by iguanas or eaten by iguanas. Another thing are mongooses, which are they're rodent, I'm pretty sure. They're sort of like a long squirrel, I guess.
Yeah, mustelid.
Yeah, mustelid. They kind of look like an otter or something like that.
Similar, yeah.
But they're more terrestrial. They're the leading carrier of rabies in Puerto Rico, which is interesting. So that's sort of a human impact. And also other animals that they're interacting with, they can give rabies. They were brought to control the rat population on sugarcane farms in the 1870s, which is a classic story of humans moving to islands, bringing a species, introducing another species, and each action sort of just makes the whole problem worse. Because rats were becoming a pest problem, so they brought mongoose to deal with the rats, but they of course brought the rats in the first place too, on ships with Columbus and stuff. Mongoose are very harmful to many of the species that they prey on, especially ground nesting birds, and this has been a huge problem in Hawaii as well, the mongoose population decimating local birds. Another thing, the kudzu vine. I first saw this a few years ago. My sister goes to school in South Carolina, and we were just driving down the highway, and I was like, oh my gosh, what is this vine engulfing the entire forest? I would look up kudzu vine, Kudzu, if you're at home. Just pictures of it. It is remarkable how it just eats pretty much it engulfs the entire forest, outcompeting everything below it, from grasses to trees, shading over everything. It's pretty crazy. It was a much worse problem in South Carolina than Puerto Rico to my observation, but I noticed it there again. That comes from Asia. I think they think it was first introduced from Japan or something like that. But I've never seen anything that is so dominant in my life compared to the kudzu vine. I guess we can maybe take a quick break here, and then we'll be back with you guys for some more main examples, some more general properties of invasive species and stuff.
Yeah, just kind of talk about the biology as a whole. So stay tuned for some public service announcements very briefly, and then we'll jump back in. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Who doesn't want a shiny new electronic device? Sure, back home there's a garage or a basement full of old electronics that we don't talk about. But old electronics aren't garbage, and they're not useless. They're full of parts and materials that can be recycled into new electronics or donated to some wonderful causes. That flip phone and old computer can still live on. Recycling electronics is the green thing to do. It's the right thing to do, and it's so easy. Log on to greenergadgets.org and enter your zip code to find the recycling center nearest you.
With recent reports showing that the world is not on track to meet climate targets, it's time to take action on climate change. The IPCC and over 3,600 economists call for a carbon fee and dividend legislation. A national carbon fee and dividend would put the U.S. on track to reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050, while financially benefiting low-income and marginalized communities. Bowdoin students are taking part in a national movement calling on Congress to enact this policy and invite you to ask your representatives to support a carbon fee and dividend. This announcement is a public service of WBOR 91.1 FM.
All right, thank you for listening. This is WBOR 91.1 FM. Again, I'm Roger.
I'm John.
And this is our show, Bear Tracks. We were talking about invasive and endemic species today, focusing quite a bit on the tropics, but hoping now, this last half hour, to give you a broader overview of the biology and relationships between these two animals, how they move around, how they interact with one another, and how they can be either detrimental or beneficial to a place. We've already defined endemic species as being organisms that are very localized to a specific region, and invasive species as being invaders, for lack of a better term, animals coming in and generally having detrimental impact on their environment. And as we may be thinking how to deal with invasive species in our own community here in Maine or anywhere around the world, it's important to consider how different invasive species can travel from one place to another. There are a variety of different mechanisms that are used by invasive species to move around. That may be offering them a bit more agency than deserved, because often it's the human impetus that moves these species around. But of these, vehicles and watercraft are a big one in the modern era, transporting a lot of fouling organisms like mussels that occur on and develop on the bottom of ships. When you take them from one body of water to the next, those mussels can either spawn or fall off and break off into new bodies of water and establish own communities there. This example, or this can be considered with the zebra mussel in a lot of Midwestern areas that have moved in from different kind of boat trafficking and watercraft and have really taken hold in lakes and river systems in those communities, expanding a ton, outcompeting a lot of other really necessary organisms that are endemic to those regions.
Yeah, zebra mussels are specifically a huge problem in Minnesota, where I'm from. In pretty much every lake. It's sort of like a miracle if you go to a lake and you find out they don't have zebra mussels. Then you got to be extra careful about scrubbing your boat off,
I bet,
and checking the ballasts and everything. But yeah, they are like if you pull like just an aquatic plant out of a lake, odds are there are just gonna be dozens and dozens of zebra mussels all over it, and they're small and they're pointy and they're not fun to step on. And they really they eat all that, they suck all the algae out of the water, they consume it all, which gets rid of the food source for native mollusk species, and then it makes the water way more sunlight shine through the water, which is not what the native species are used to, and actually it helps other invasive species such as Eurasian milfoil, which also is spread by watercraft, grow tall and outcompete the native vegetation on the aquatic vegetation. So.
Yeah, I mean it's one of the many methods. Others include intentional introduction of organisms. That's been seen. John mentioned mongoose in Puerto Rico, and that is not unique to Puerto Rico. A lot of settlers and other islands have brought mongoose in to deal with other environmental issues. For example, in Okinawa in Japan, mongoose were brought in to deal with poisonous snakes on the island. But as soon as the mongoose realized that it was a lot easier to eat local birds than it was to catch and kill a poisonous snake, they ended up stop attacking the snakes entirely and only went after birds. And so it ended up being a complete ecological disaster that still plagues the region today. Other intentional introduction stories include deer on Monhegan Island in the northern Maine area, focus of a lot of researchers here at Bowdoin. But the deer were brought there to offer kind of artists new inspiration, also to offer hunters a new opportunity to kind of expand the game with which they sought. And after a few decades, the tick problem and Lyme disease became a huge issue. The deer had to be removed from the island. So really, again, just kind of ultimately becoming a debacle in the end, though there were definitely good intentions and foresight in bringing the deer to the island in the first place.
The deer were you talk about brought for grazing and also like for game hunting.
Yeah.
So people also intentionally introduce illegally. That was like a community decided thing, but people also illegally introduce species on purpose, such as stocking fish. Here in Maine, we see that with northern pike, which I was sort of shocked to learn were not native to places like Maine and kind of everywhere. It's just I grew up with northern pike and all the lakes. They're native to the Great Lakes region, so I kind of just thought they were the freshwater fish everywhere in America. It turns out not really, just sort of the states surrounding Minnesota. But they're a great, for a fisherman like myself, they're a great species to catch. They're big, they give a good fight, all sorts of stuff. They got sharp teeth, which is not a plus, but they're a predatory fish, so they've been illegally introduced into many of Maine's rivers and lakes, and they outcompete native species like salmon for their food source for the smaller fish, so they can be pretty problematic in that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's there are so many big issues, and it goes to show that a lot of the invasive species that come in have been brought in so long ago that they're just super localized in the area. And a little fun fact from Maine is that Littorina littorea, the small snails that you see along the intertidal coast all throughout here, they're not native. They're European colonizers that settlers brought in because they thought the snails we had here were too small for escargot when they first came over. And these animals have just taken over and now are a very active and important part of the trophic systems in coastal ecosystems here in Maine.
It was interesting. This is Roger and I took a class called Biology of Marine Organisms, which talked about all of the sort of intertidal habitats throughout Maine, and several other classes I've had since then have talked about this habitat, and we've gone out to the rocky intertidal, and the species you see most of animal besides the plants is Littorina littorea. I mean, they're everywhere. And despite learning about them and being out there, I don't recall ever actually learning that they weren't native, which, not to fault the professors or anything, but it is remarkable how sometimes under the I suppose it was long enough ago they were brought here, we don't really know what species they might have outcompeted. But it's also kind of to say non-native species can fit into an ecosystem and not be overwhelming and not be inherently invasive. But that's not, it's not an evilness of the invasive species, it's just out of their nature. They might just fit into the ecosystem better. Or you think of all of the non-native house plants or like garden plants that people introduce. Maybe they just don't spread great. Maybe they need some assistance living in a place like Maine so they don't overpopulate. We'll talk about a plant later when we get to all the Maine invasive species, some of them, that sort of doesn't fit this mold and does produce monocultures after being introduced into gardens and stuff.
Yeah, that's true. Definitely. Again, kind of like the northern pike, it's become such a localized part of the population in the area and the community that even if it is still having impacts, they've been exacerbated over so many years that it isn't really as tangible anymore. Some other thoughts on the way in which invasive species move. The U.S. Forestry Service has mentioned wood or firewood, and I think that's much more local, but definitely can transport like leaf-boring insects across smaller areas, from one state to another, or even within a city, but can also, if transported over, through ships over geographic larger scales, you can see a lot of insects coming in that cause a lot of large-scale problems as well. And many of you listeners might remember, kind of in the late 1970s, 1980s, you'll see kind of a lot of insects that were coming in from Asia, perhaps the Japanese beetles, that decimated crops across the Midwest. And because they have predators naturally in their environments in Japan, they were less of an issue there. But when they came over to the United States, few animals here were actually well adapted to tackle that problem. And the beetles ran rampant until humans stepped up the pesticide game, which of course then had its own slew of problems, which we can discuss later as kind of the attempts at wrangling invasives, but also the downsides of many of the human-based efforts to stop them, a lot of which we're kind of proving that humans were at their wits' end with invasive species, and in many ways still are. There are definitely efforts to combat them, but it is very difficult to tackle a species that hits the ground running and settles in a new place. Two other main pieces they're very related. The first is ornamental plant trade. It's a lot of other animals coming in on plants traded across the world, so you'll see beautiful flowers. Of course, people, Asia and the tropics have so many amazing organisms, so people in the U.S. want to bring those in. And I think that's how the Japanese beetles came in, was through azaleas or so from Japan. So you see this kind of global trade and movement having a lot of unforeseen consequences environmentally. And the last, and one of the biggest, I think, especially in warmer areas, and less impactful in Maine and in New Mexico, where I'm from, and I'll talk about that in a moment, is this idea of releasing pet animals when they become too big, too hard to deal with, if someone's moving and doesn't want to either, rightfully so, does not want to put them down or does not want to return to a pet store. So a lot of the animals like goldfish, anacondas, lionfish, iguanas, many of these are tropical, but they all kind of started with the impetus of being released by people when they bought them and realized that, oh my gosh, my iguana that I purchased isn't going to be 2 inches long for the rest of its life. It's going to go up to be 3 feet, and I can't take care of this thing anymore. I can't feed it. So they release it out into the wild. And that's true of other organisms as well, goldfish, anacondas. And I can try to break that down a little bit more as we talk about where invasive species are most prominent and why, and what impacts they have. But I think before that, we've already talked a lot about this. John brought this up with Puerto Rico and his trip, but overall, just kind of the insight and overview of what problems arise with invasive species in their communities. The biggest issue is that invasive species can outcompete other species in the region, and most invasive species that are most negative to local species are predators. You'll see stuff like mongoose going after organisms that, because they evolved on their own outside of the presence of monkeys for so long, have absolutely, one, no physical prowess to deal with them. They don't have any mechanisms developed within their actual body to combat any predators they aren't used to or did not evolve alongside for a long time. Also, they simply have no sense of how to deal with them. If you think about the dodo, which is a bird that evolved and went extinct years ago, but evolved very isolated on the islands of Mauritius outside of Africa. When settlers came in and brought organisms to which they were not used to, the dodo showed no fear at all, which was ultimately its downfall. It was a flightless bird and nested on the ground, but because it had no fear of organisms coming in, it simply did not react to them in a way that was beneficial to it at all. Invasive species can also be potentially dangerous to people, depending on the scale with which they evolve and expand. And if you consider bacteria an invasive species, this is also maybe a bit of a stretch, but considering COVID invasive species even, it can have extreme detriments when spread over large scales, really with travel being this primary impetus for that. The same is true for plant pollen, which can cause a lot of respiratory allergies. And overall, the biggest takeaway is that it's really just bad for wildlife and the environment in general, but especially localized, uniquely evolved species. Looking up a few facts about this last night, I learned that about 40% of critically endangered species are facing severe declines or have declined in population size drastically over the last few decades because of invasive species, because they don't know how to react to organisms coming in to new environments, especially those that evolved in isolation, like islands. And we can break that down a little bit more in a bit. I'll give a brief overview of the tropics. Maybe we can get into more of the main stuff moving forward to kind of tie it all together for those who might be listening in the area. I've mentioned that organisms are very unique in the tropics, and that's where invasive species are often the most prominent. That's probably because the tropics have a very unique and constant climate. Naturally, if you're going to be moving to a new place, it's going to be a lot easier for you to adjust if you don't have to deal with temperature swings as well. It also doesn't help that hot climates have a lot of niches in food availability. There's just more energy in the system, so there's more opportunities for invasive species to expand. And then last but not least, of course, many organisms that were released in the pet trade are tropical organisms. That's iguanas, anacondas. They are big, they are pretty, they're funny looking, and so people want to buy them more. But because a lot of these organisms also have very unpredictable life histories, especially if you are not well informed before purchasing them, you might end up releasing them and causing a lot of issues. That's why Florida has so many invasive species that have totally run amok. But at this point, because they've been there for so long, have kind of integrated into Florida society, and many people don't even consider them invasive anymore at this point, just non-native. And then lastly, islands. John's talked a lot about Puerto Rico, and you can maybe jump in if you have any input on this from what you saw while you were there. But islands, because they're so isolated, are the most impacted by endemic species, both impacted by invasive species, thank you, with endemic species being highly localized, because organisms can't travel out of the island, and because population sizes on islands are so small. Once an invasive species gets there and again hits the ground running, there's really few means to stop it, and the animals can't really flee. They're just kind of at the mercy of invasive species, becoming this its own ecosystem on an island. But of course, endemic species and invasive species, especially invasive species, are not an issue only for the tropics and for islands. They are prominent everywhere throughout the U.S. We've kind of highlighted that a little bit with northern pike and stuff. Well, in the world, of course, throughout the world. It's especially as international trade and modernity kind of developed over the 1900s. But we'd like to highlight, I think, a lot of species in Maine that are both native and introduced to kind of offer greater insight into the local community and maybe bring things together here and spark some interest for things you might never you knew just from walking around the woods or the coast here.
Yeah, so we've talked about a few of these. I think I'll maybe start with some of the ones I looked at, one being purple loosestrife. So this is the plant I sort of hinted at earlier. The scientific name, I'll give an attempt here, is Lythrum salicaria. And purple loosestrife is sort of, you could look it up. I guess it's kind of hard to describe. I'm sure you would recognize it. It's essentially like, if you think of a stand being like a big group of plants with like long, tall stems with a lot of purple flowers growing on all sides of the stem, and the stems are kind of in thick bunches. That's purple loosestrife. It's an invasive species here. It's a problem in Minnesota. So over a large range within North America, within the U.S. It has a square woody stem, and it's It's in almost every U.S. state and in nearly every Canadian province. And the crazy thing about these plants is they have the ability to produce as many as 2 million seeds in a growing season, just one plant, which is sort of another hallmark of invasive species, especially plants. If they're really good at spreading, or an animal really good at, well, and plants have to reproduce too, but like if animals such as rodents, which we've talked about many times, reproduce rapidly, that can be good for, you can establish a population from a small number very quickly. But these purple loosestrife create dense groups of themselves that outcompete native plants, and it just sort of becomes a monoculture. And they change ecosystem functions. They reduce nesting sites for birds, shelter for animals that need shelter. They reduce food for birds, and then it's just an overall decline in biodiversity. And because they have these dense stands and they create shade, they're creating an idealized environment for themselves and then completely outcompeting the native plants. Yeah, and they were introduced here to Maine by ships and also for gardening. Ships are sort of the classic, mostly because we didn't have other, ships came before planes and stuff like that. But I guess ships also just, they carry things in the hull. It's just a slower moving. Ships, often large ships with cargo, but even the early ships like the Mayflower and things like that really brought a lot of, are typical for bringing invasive species. And I wanted to know one other way that is a common way that plants spread. I don't know if this is exactly the case with purple loosestrife, but it is the case with plants particularly is seeds that just attach to you or your shoes or are just in the ground that your boots might pick up while you're out on a hike. You hike in one place and then maybe you pack your boots up in a suitcase and you go on a trip, or even you just you hike a few weeks later in a completely different forest in a different part of Maine, say. These seeds that maybe were in wet mud and have dried into your shoes then fall off in another place, and perhaps that's a non-native species, and you've now spread them. So being sure after you go on a hike to, you can get little tools. I got one for free at the Minnesota State Fair this past summer.
Cool.
But there's a brush on one end and a little pick on the other end. But just being sure to brush your shoes off and make sure you're not bringing seeds from point A to point B when they maybe don't belong either place, or maybe they belong in point A but they don't belong in point B. That's a big way of spreading invasive plants.
And these small scale changes to your lifestyle they may seem totally irrelevant, just kind of like recycling a plastic bottle here and there, but can really have a pretty big impact, especially if they become more and more prominent throughout a population, especially in areas like Maine where we take so much pride in the environment and nature here. It's important to keep it as pristine as we can, especially along the coast or in the forested areas.
Yeah. Do you want to take another? Maybe we can go back and forth here. Do you want to take one of these species?
Yeah, it sounds good. I think I mentioned deer on Mohegan briefly. I think green crabs are an important one to mention. They're widely accepted as a big issue here in Maine. I'm sure to anyone who's listening from the local area, this is no new news that invasive green crabs are a big problem for local populations of crabs. They outcompete Jonah and rock crabs. And if you ever have the opportunity on the coast, walking around here, either in Brunswick or even north of here, around Rockport or Camden, if you look at a green crab and a Jonah crab just interact both with one another and with the surroundings on their own, you'll see that green crabs are far more aggressive. They're faster, they're meaner, and coming from Asia, decades ago, if not maybe even centuries ago, I'm not sure when they moved over, probably with early trade between continents, green crabs really just took over. They outcompeted Jonah and rock crabs. They were over-aggressive, attacked them, got their resources, and now have really become a huge part of the Maine ecosystem. Still for worse, I think. In many cases, a lot of species that have been here for a long time kind of acclimate fairly well at this point, or they're at least not viewed really as being as problematic anymore. But green crabs still are. They expand at a rapid rate. Their population grows at a rapid rate. They also don't taste very good. There's been a big push for people to eat green crabs to hope to minimize the impact and population growth. You can give it a try. I personally haven't tried it. I've heard mixed reviews. Overall, I've heard they don't taste great, but people are really pushing to develop recipes to kind of ameliorate any negative taste and try to fix that. But they're a really important species to consider.
Yeah, how about there's a better tasting crab that you said is sort of helping solve the problem.
There is. There's another Chinese crab species. Oh no, the blue crab. Blue crab. Right. Well, so we can bring up potentially, the good and bad attempts at stopping invasive species, but in many cases now with climate change, you have species moving around, which in some cases can cause invasive species moving into new areas that are negative. But in the case of green crabs, you have blue crabs that have been gradually migrating up from the Maryland area and more south along the eastern coast of the United States up into Maine. These blue crabs are a lot bigger. They're a lot stronger than green crabs. And they have been shown in some smaller research studies recently to eat green crabs. I think there's a lot of work being done at Bowdoin's affiliate Schiller Coastal Studies Center down the coast here, looking at how effective is it really to consider blue crabs a natural means of getting rid of green crabs in the area. And it seems to be quite promising. A lot of work still needs to be done, especially as they move more northward. But of course, blue crabs could also have potential negative,
of course,
downsides on Jonah and rock crabs as well. So it's this kind of juggling act, this constant balance of trying to see, are the blue crabs really going to be beneficial? Are they really going to be negative? I don't think those things are mutually exclusive, and I think that especially as they move northward and as lobsters kind of shift in their range as well, we're going to see some pretty big changes to at least certainly the invertebrate populations within the main coastal ecosystem. But again, because all pieces of an ecosystem are connected, those changes should appear elsewhere as well, and things that may not be obvious to any viewers from the outside. We just have to kind of wait and see. It's hard to say.
Yeah, another invasive species that was familiar to me, seeing as it's also an issue in Minnesota, is, and I'm sure many people here are familiar as well, is the emerald ash borer. This is a beetle species from it's Asia. I'm pretty certain. I'm struggling. I'm losing exactly where it came from, specifically where it came from, but it came from Eurasia. I think Asia specifically, and it is. It infects ash trees, most notably green ash, black ash, and white ash, but also all species of ash trees. And that, spans from up here in Maine through Canada, down into states like Texas and all the way over to Minnesota. And I'm sure, at least in Minnesota, I assume they do something similar here in Maine. Most of the ash trees are gone, so I don't see it as much, but you'll see just a suburban neighborhood or just a neighborhood with houses, and all of a sudden ash trees are hugely popular for being planted on the side of streets, they're huge, all the shade they provide, things like this. Suddenly every tree on the street just has, green plastic wrap around them, marking them for emerald ash borers, because they move through these ash like crazy, infecting all of them. And these ash borers kill the tree, obviously, unfortunately, and they've been pretty devastating to ash all throughout the ash's range, and to all species of ash. So it's these, some of the worst invasive species are these things like insects, or I'll talk soon about the chestnut blight, like these fungal species that, are hyper specialized to a certain type of tree, but that certain type of tree in their native range has evolved resistance to them. But then they're brought to another place, and they can just be completely devastating to specific species. And also, as we know, every species plays an important role in the greater ecology and the environment of its native area. So they can be devastating to the ecology as a whole.
I think this brings an important point to light of the role of kind of plants in their systems, especially in relation to invasive and endemics. We could even talk about this in a future show. John and I have a decent background in plant physiology as well, but plants are very easily overlooked in the system. That is both when they are the victims of something like the emerald ash borer and the ash trees in the region. They also are easily overlooked, I think, as an invasive species in many cases, especially outside of a research scope. I think many people tend to focus on megafauna. Charismatic megafauna is the kind of colloquial term for bigger animals that capture humans' attention. But even as something as small as an ash borer or a green crab is likely to get more attention than something next to someone who is trying to build a house on a new lot, and that lot was covered with Chinese elm. So it's an invasive species in the area. It grows like a weed, but a very large, tall, woody weed. And the guy trying to build his house cut down all of the elm on the property, constructed his house, and now we're back 2 years later. It's walking down memory lane with my buddy across his property, and the elm are already growing back. And so it's going to be, I think, for that unfortunate guy, a long battle to clear his property. Hopefully one that he can win, both for his own sake and for the benefit of that kind of river ecosystem in Mexico in its own right. Before we trade back to chestnut blight, which I don't know much about at all, I'm excited to hear more about it. I also want to mention eastern cottontails and New England cottontails here. New England cottontails are a very, very cute, small rabbit species that is native to Maine and native to areas around New England. It used to be very widespread across the region. They would inhabit mostly kind of brushy areas at forest edges and benefit a lot, actually, from initial kind of clearing of forests for farming, because they moved around and had more habitat to expand into. But as farmers, kind of small-scale farming kind of came to a close in Maine, and a lot of forests began to redevelop over this farmland, the cottontails kind of lost a lot of their habitat. And so now they're broken up into very localized regions, both in Maine, but also in a few other states like Connecticut. So you can still see them in places like the Rachel Carson Reserve down south of Brunswick. Definitely worth going to check them out. They're cool species. But to exacerbate the impacts of these, not necessarily endemic to Maine, but definitely localized species, there has been a large influx of another type of cottontail. It was the eastern cottontail, Civilagus floridanus, which is coming up from the south in Florida and moving northward. And it's not necessarily causing a huge impact to the environment in the same way as the green crab is, but it is outcompeting New England cottontails in their localized regions for resources. And interestingly, it is also inbreeding, crossbreeding with New England cottontails. So maybe not having a direct impact from the New England cottontail's perspective, but certainly causing this interesting genetic drift and species change over time, which, again, because eastern cottontails are moving northward more naturally, as far as I know, this may be less of an imperative focus compared to stuff like, the green crab issues, or stuff like emerald ash borer that come in at a more rapid rate from human influence. Definitely interesting to consider kind of the complexities of endemic or localized species and invasive species and the ways in which they interact.
Yeah, actually, I'm just looking it up now. The New England cottontail is considered a vulnerable species for extinction rather than, like a least concern species. It's not quite endangered or critically endangered, but it is vulnerable, which is usually not a great sign.
Yeah. There's a great resource online, before I pass off to John for the chestnut blight, called the IUCN Red List, and they do a really nice job of analyzing species across the world and trying to put a label on their level of concern with which we should consider them for conservation. So that's, critically endangered to vulnerable, concerned, least concerned. And it's definitely an ever-growing list, but it does help you to kind of frame the way in which we consider a lot of the animals, both locally and around. And I don't think, I'm not sure it's the most effective to say, an animal's least concern, when in actuality it's hard to judge that. I think it may not necessarily always be the case, but especially with, critically endangered and endangered species, it raises alarm bells, hopefully to the general public, but certainly to facilities like zoos or wildlife parks, to really put greater emphasis on certain species to redevelop their populations in hopes of establishing them in the wild or raising awareness about their plight.
Yeah, and also just a little bit more on the New England cottontail. This actually says the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says the eastern cottontail, sort of to one of the things we were talking about earlier, was actually brought to the New England region as a game species in the early 1900s.
That makes sense too.
So, so the two species, New England cottontail and eastern cottontail, are almost identical visually. This makes conservation efforts particularly difficult when you can't tell them apart without looking at their skulls.
It's true.
You can't intentionally, for example, hunt something, and then we're a little over time here, but our host afterwards called in. He didn't actually call in sick, but for lack of a better term, called in sick today. So we can take a little bit of time. We can maybe briefly talk about some of the ethics of dealing with invasive species and stuff.
Yeah, that'd be great.
It's hard to manage a species when it's being outcompeted by a non-native invasive species when the two species look almost the same, right? So, yeah.
Very true. Very true.
So I think this is maybe the last main invasive species we wanted to highlight.
I think so. If others come to mind, we can bring them up. But these are big ones for sure.
There are many, but is chestnut blight, which many of you may be familiar with. I don't know. I guess I wasn't really familiar with it until recently, and then I haven't really researched it until the other day. So for this episode, So chestnut blight is a necrotrophic fungus. Necrotrophic being one way of classifying plant pathogens. So they can either be necrotrophs or biotrophs. And necrotrophs kill cells and then feed on them, whereas biotrophs just sort of parasitize cells, but they keep them alive, feeding on them. So that's to say that the chestnut blight, being a necrotrophic fungus, which is native to East Asia and Southeast Asia, and it was introduced into Europe and North America in the early 1900s, kills the cells, obviously, so it kills the chestnut trees, which were already facing a variety of different threats to their population. So the chestnut blight has effectively killed all of the American chestnuts, the entire species, ranging from Maine all the way down into Mississippi. And so the species is functionally extinct, unfortunately. So you really do not see American chestnuts anymore, which I think were quite a grand treat. We did see some on a hike this last semester with one of my classes. They are huge trees when they really grow up, when they, I guess, kind of used to grow up and thrive. Like really ginormous trees. But
really important for humans in the area too. A lot of construction work being done with chestnut wood.
They used to be a huge source of lumber and stuff, but really not anymore because it's not viable to grow them. So you will see chestnut trees out sometimes, but it is sort of gloomy and doomy because you know they are doomed to succumb to the chestnut blight and die, even if you see them looking healthy. The blight maybe just hasn't gotten to them yet, unfortunately. Interestingly, though, the blight cannot kill the underground root system of chestnuts, since the pathogen is unable to compete with the soil microorganisms. We could also maybe one day do a entire episode on like the relationship between microorganisms and mycorrhizal
that'd be interesting.
Fungi and trees and forests.
So many things to talk about.
There are, yes. So it's another benefit of the microbial communities in the soil, assisting in a symbiotic relationship, these trees. But so the fungi can't kill the roots of the trees, and chestnuts, I guess fortunately, are able to grow from their stumps. So sprouts grow from the stump vigorously in habitats that are cut over or disturbed. Sort of in a way, humans disturbing habitats can help these chestnuts that have been decimated, because by cutting them down to their stump and removing all competition, so there's plenty of light availability, sprouts will grow from the chestnut stumps. And then, so this is nice, but unfortunately, these sprouts, no matter how large they grow, they will fall eventually to the blight, and so it's sort of an endless cycle of death and rebirth, which is keeping the species alive, but doesn't get to an age where it produces seeds and can reproduce, so it is still considered functionally extinct. Although they are working on efforts to sort of, I think, kind of genetically engineer or whatever, a strain of the tree that is resistant to the chestnut blight, so that maybe this species can someday return to the eastern United States.
There's a lot of potential stories like that that really offer hope, I think, in the idea of endemics versus non-native species and kind of the plight of invasive species, or endemics and non-native species versus endemic species.
Right.
I think we want to discuss, as kind of final thoughts, some ethics around the removal of invasive non-native species, just to kind of pick the brains of the audience, but also hopefully kind of plant the seed of something you can take with you and think about as you interact with the environment. Before that, I'd like to overall just address some attempts to stop invasive species in history that have been both effective and ineffective. I also want to specifically mention that in Maine, we are very fortunate to have a climate with a lot of fluctuation that really limits the ability of invasive species to really expand. If you consider rhododendron, which is not necessarily an invasive species, but certainly non-native species from Asia, if you look at forests in South Carolina, say, rhododendron are brought as an ornamental plant and have expanded throughout natural areas across state lines, across the state. Really, in Maine, they're also very localized plants around houses, in community gardens, parks. But because of such harsh winters, rhododendron in this area, Maine is really the northern boundary of their range. They can't really expand. And so, New Mexico is similar in that it's very hot, it's very dry. Species that live there are very specialized their environment. Species that are released into the wild or inadvertently brought by other means simply just can't take hold. So Maine's fortunate to have harsh winters that also help in that regard, but clearly it does not stop everything as we discussed. Yeah. Overall, some historical attempts. There have been many different attempts to stop invasive species. Pesticides on a large scale were used for stuff like the Japanese beetle and other things that attacked farmland, like DDT. These, I think it's no news to anyone, especially those that maybe a little bit older and lived through this, older than us certainly, that DDT is a very bad thing. It was a stopgap that at first seemed extremely valuable, extremely useful for killing endemic or localized populations of invasive species of bugs, insects that were attacking plants, but had a lot of other deleterious impacts on bird populations and other organisms throughout the world. So pesticides, generally bad, not viable for invasive species removal. Other methods include the introduction of other species, which, like mongoose we saw on Okinawa, Puerto Rico, other islands, also bad, not really a great impact on the environment as a whole, even though they can be somewhat effective in the short term. You also, when introducing invasive species to combat other invasive species, you usually have to remove them later, like deer on Monhegan or in the Galapagos. They would literally have so many goats on islands, people would just come in and just have to pull them off in heaps and loads, and it was really kind of unbelievable. So again, negative impact there, even though goats were brought intentionally. But the modern migration of animals like the blue crabs I mentioned and may offer potential natural means to combat green crabs. And of course, while these might have negative impacts in and of themselves, they likely at this point pose one of the greatest means of reducing highly large population booms of invasive species in certain areas.
Yeah, and I think, sort of can leave it to conservationists and things and people that are really working on these larger scale efforts, which is, ecosystems are so complex. It's really just impossible to figure out the ramifications of any given action you might take to try to slow down an invasive species or, get rid of it altogether. But I think just on an individual level, it's important to remember the things you can do. You can wipe your boots off after hiking. You can, cooperate and check in with, at least in Minnesota, at most water bodies on boat launches, they have somebody there to check your boat. I assume that's maybe a thing here in Maine as well.
Probably.
Or you can do it yourself, before you launch your boat into a new body of water. Look under your boat. Is there any seaweed? Make sure to empty your ballast, things like this. Do not, be wary of the plants you're planting in your garden. Try to plant native plants rather than non-native plants that can become invasive, can spread beyond where you think they are. You plant one plant, it could produce 2 million seeds, and then suddenly it's created 3,000 new plants, in the field down a mile away or whatever. And, if you are going to get a pet, be conscious of your ability to take care of said pet and never release your pet into the wild. Find another way to maybe give it to a veterinarian or humane society or whoever might take it from you. Or maybe there's a friend that would be excited about having a 6-foot green iguana or something like that. Or maybe just, maybe if you want to look at an animal, go outside and look at your local animals.
Also true. Instead
of keeping one in a tank.
Yeah. I think to wrap up, we can do some final thoughts and just kind of think about, the ethics behind removing invasive species. While invasive species can be viewed as a group of organisms as a whole that can have very detrimental impacts to communities, it's also important to realize these animals weren't brought to wherever they are of their own accord. They
were brought.
Or not of their own.
Yeah, not of their own accord.
Not of their own accord. And so the animals in these areas, yes, they don't belong maybe in said areas, but they're just doing the best they can to survive. And if that means that they're highly effective and outcompete endemic species, that's a bad thing for the environment, but it's not their choice. And so it brings into this issue of how to deal with them. I think these animals are also individually sentient, in my opinion. You have green crabs and ash borers. They may seem less so sentient than something like a mongoose or an iguana, something with a lot more, charisma and maybe that is able to kind of build more intimate relationships with people. But it is important to consider all animals as sentient, I think, especially when considering the removal and addition of organisms to certain communities. And again, it's important to consider that not all non-native species are bad. Many are around us that we don't even realize because they've been so indoctrinated into our community, and many can potentially pose even beneficial additions to any ecosystem. I would say that those are likely few and far between, but they're not all bad. So thinking about how to deal with invasive species is complex. It's certainly not as simple, in my opinion, as just removing them. That also can have other unforeseen consequences for the environment. Ecosystems are complex. They require a lot of love and care. But there are a lot of people that are working very closely with individual species, like those in Fish and Wildlife working to, say, help doing cottontail populations. These people are doing a lot of great work, a lot of great focused work, trying to develop ecosystems and ameliorate any negative impacts on invasive species in a way that is sustainable and ethical and considerate of the other impacts on the environment. And I think I'm very grateful to those people, especially here in Maine.
Right. So they're great, I think. Should we wrap up, maybe?
I think so, yeah. I think that's a good overview.
Yeah, well, thank you all, everybody, very much for listening today. As a reminder, you are listening to 91.1 WBOR FM here at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. You were listening to Bear Tracks, Stories of the Natural World. I emphasized the subtitle to announce and sort of encourage everybody to, in case they're interested in some of the past episodes we've done or future episodes you might not be able to tune with. We're here every Thursday, 9 to 10 a.m. Eastern, just like we were this week. But over break, I worked on uploading our shows to some streaming platforms. So we're out on Spotify, we're out on Amazon Stream, whatever that is. We're out on Audible. We're at all over, hopefully on Apple Music soon, or Apple Podcasts. That's been sort of giving us some issues, but we're on CastBox, we're on iHeartRadio. So look us up, Bear Tracks, We're not a huge podcast, so the Stories of the Natural World is important. By the time you get to stories, it should come up. But yeah, this is Bear Tracks. I'm John.
I'm Roger.
Thanks so much for listening. Look at something cool today, whether it's a tree or a bug or just a sunset.
Yeah, with this beautiful weather, get outside and hopefully take a closer look. That's all the animals really need. All the plants really need is someone to give them a bit more attention.
Right. Have a good one. Stay wild.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks so much.